Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity and the privilege of speaking to you this afternoon, participate in this really important meeting. In a lot of ways, what I have to say has already been powerfully said in very articulate ways. Mike and Jennifer, I especially want to thank you for your courage in sharing your story, Marcus's story with us, and we're so sorry for your loss. The question that we confront here personally and as a society is, how should we then die? Not so long ago, dying signified the loss of choice, something over which we had no choice. But now, with the advent of euthanasia, death has very much become a matter of choice, a question of whether we will avail ourselves of a doctor to end our lives in the manner and timing of our own choosing. For many, this came as welcome news. They said they did not fear death, only dying. To have control over their death seemed liberating and empowering. Yet with the possibility of choice comes the weighty and burdensome responsibility of choosing. If you suffer grievously with an untreatable condition, the possibility of seeking euthanasia constantly lurks in the background. Every day you must choose whether to go on with life, for refusing euthanasia is as much a choice as accepting it. And each of us must be prepared to respond to this question. Eventually, all of us must face our own mortality, and some of us may experience very real physical or mental suffering in life, even as we've already heard this afternoon. Some of us may end up living with serious disability. Our friends and family members may contemplate assisted death. And over the last decade, healthcare professionals like myself have been forced to face this issue, to decide if we will participate, and if not, to defend our refusal to be complicit. This afternoon, I want to tell you why I am persuaded that we must say no to euthanasia. I offer you two reasons you've already heard from others. These are the true depth of human value and the true greatness of human purpose. First, the true depth of human value. In 1993, when physician-assisted death was first contemplated by the Supreme Court of Canada in the case of Sue Rodriguez, Justice John Sopinka's decision against assisted death affirmed the generally held and deeply rooted belief in our society that human life is sacred or inviolable as a fundamental reason to forbid this practice. And strikingly, just 20 years later in 2015, when euthanasia was legalized by the Supreme Court in the Carter case, this principle no longer seemed to carry any weight. This idea of the sacredness of life, that persons are holy and untouchable, no longer carries much currency in our culture. Perhaps the language of sacredness smacks too much of religion for a post-Christian society. Yet for all our unwillingness to call people sacred, everyone seems to feel very strongly that people matter. Even advocates for euthanasia argue that euthanasia is all about promoting human dignity, compassion for suffering, respect for choices. Their argument, in other words, is predicated on the idea that people matter. But when we say that people matter, just what do we mean? We need to step back and think carefully about the nature of value. I think we can speak of two kinds of value. We can speak of extrinsic value, value that comes from your usefulness. My computer is valuable to me, but only because it works. If it ceases to work, it will lose its value. Something with extrinsic value can be bought and sold, discarded and replaced. But we can also speak of intrinsic value, value that arises from the thing in itself. I value my children, not because of what they can do for me, but simply for who they are. Things that have intrinsic value are priceless and irreplaceable. So what kind of value, let us ask, do people have? People, of course, have intrinsic and incalculable value. Each of us is priceless and irreplaceable. Our value cannot be lost because we matter simply by virtue of what we are. For this reason, it is wrong to treat people as a mere means to an end. It's wrong to use people This is why slavery and sex trafficking are immoral and unethical. This is the fundamental basis for human rights. But here we come to the crux of the matter. If people matter, then it is good that they exist. Acting to end their existence, causing their death, requires us to affirm that it no longer matters that they exist. And if it doesn't matter that they exist, then they never had intrinsic, unchanging value to begin with. So we see very clearly that euthanasia devalues people. By calling into question the value of a person's existence, it necessarily calls into question the value of the person themselves. By ending the sufferer to end suffering, it treats people as a mere means to an end. We cannot support or perform euthanasia while also affirming that people have intrinsic and unchanging value. So euthanasia must be seen for what it is, an act of desecration, the desecration of intrinsically valuable persons made in God's image. This truth came home to me powerfully while I was testifying to the Senate of Canada in 2021 about plans to expand eligibility for euthanasia. Testifying next to me were two articulate and courageous women living with disabilities. They testified poignantly to the threat that euthanasia represented to the disability community, to hard years as it turned out. But as they were speaking, it struck me that while euthanasia presented a threat to my professional freedom, for these women it presented a threat to their very existence. Legalizing euthanasia for people with disabilities would not make me eligible for death, but they would become eligible. I would still be untouchable under the law, but they would not be untouchable. The law would view me as indispensable, but would regard them as disposable if they so chose. So what did it say about our comparative value in the eyes of Canadian society? The obvious conclusion is that my life matters more than theirs, hence my person matters more than theirs. And if we become disabled, then we become potentially disposable. This whole idea of euthanasia for people with disabilities sees people as if they only have extrinsic value. It's profoundly demeaning and devaluing. And once we get a clear vision of the true depth of human value, how it is intrinsic and unchanging and incalculable, once we see how euthanasia denies that value by its very definition, then we have to oppose it. We have to say no. Consider also the true greatness of human purpose. Others have testified to this afternoon. What drives the demand for assisted death? At bottom, the desire for death reflects the struggle to find meaning in life in the face of suffering. When life is easy and comparatively free of suffering, we can find ways to distract ourselves from the question of life's fundamental meaning. But when suffering enters our lives, those distractions vanish, and we are forced to face up to the question of whether there is really any point in our lives. The French existentialist playwright Albert Camus declared that, quote, "Suicide is the only serious philosophical question because there's no reason to live with the, quote, uselessness of suffering." And this idea that suffering is useless resonates deeply in our cultural moment. And the assisted death offers us a means to escape the despair that results from that sense of uselessness. In the medical literature, multiple studies from multiple institutions clearly demonstrates that people seek assisted death not because of uncontrolled physical pain, but because of despair. They're losing control of life, they fear they are just a burden, and they see no point in going on. This despair must be recognized not as a medical problem, but as a spiritual problem. Having forsaken God, we have cut ourselves off from any possibility of purpose in life that could transcend suffering. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously recognized the consequence of the death of God, so-called death of God, in his famous parable, The Madman. And I want to read a portion of it to you. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you, we have killed him. You and I, all of us are his murderers." "But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." What Nietzsche was trying to say to his contemporary citizens was that by treating God as if he was dead in their contemporary society, they were losing any objective reference point to define how we ought to live or to give us a sense of purpose in life that transcends our personal circumstances. In cutting ourselves off from God, we find ourselves with no real salvation from our pain apart from death. And even then, we blindly and foolishly assume that there is nothing beyond the grave. Euthanasia is, in this sense, the ultimate act of secular faith in the death of God. But there is good news. God is very much alive, and his Son who was crucified and buried is very much alive. The good news is that we were created with deep purpose that transcends our little life projects. As the Westminster Shorter Catechism summarizes the scriptural truth on the matter, our chief end, our highest good, our final purpose is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. In short, we were created to be worshipers. The good news is that even though we have all failed to worship God as we ought, God gave his Son to enter our suffering in this fallen world, to die and to rise again so that we could become true worshipers, so that we would forever in his presence fulfill our highest good and final purpose. So how then do we respond when the brokenness of this world crashes into our lives? How do we find purpose when we're confronted by grievous and irremediable suffering? Friends, if you can say with Job, "Though he slay me, yet I will trust him." If you can say, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord." If you can say in grief and through tears, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." If you can worship and serve God as an end in himself and not value him merely for his gifts, then you are truly worshiping. In this way, suffering serves only to deepen our meaning and clarify our purpose. We don't need assisted death because we have found true life. So in conclusion, in light of the true, incalculable depth of human value and the true and unthinkable greatness of our purpose, how should we then die? Not at our own hand, nor by the hand of our doctor. Not forgetting the depth of our value or doubting the goodness of our existence. Not giving up on our purpose or refusing to worship the giver when we cannot have all his gifts. We must recognize euthanasia for what it is, an act of desecration performed in despair. Friends, our calling is to remind our neighbors and our loved ones just how much they matter, to help them see that they are priceless and irreplaceable, to work to relieve their suffering, to accompany them in their trial, and to point them to their true purpose. We must do this in both word and deed, with patience and perseverance, through prayer and in the power of the Holy Spirit. This task is hard. It's a call to suffer with those who are suffering. We must keep before us the one who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Amen. Thank you.